Looking at the state of the world right now, it's not super difficult to see that things are not as good as they could or really should be. That being said, I do want this project to be a vehicle for positivity, and I've chosen to focus on small towns because I believe that they will be great societal microcosms that represent communal growth. Now, I have no delusion that prejudices, be they social, racial, whatever, somehow just miraculously don't exist in small towns. But it is my belief, it is my hope that as I travel across this country, what I'll find is that these small communities really embody what it is to grow beyond their own previously conceived notions and limitations. Of course, to really understand how a community has grown, you do have to have at least some base understanding of where they were before. And those questions can make people uncomfortable. Luckily for me, I have a friend who happens to work at the Moton Museum, formerly the Moton School, here in Farmville, which, for reasons that I'll let him explain, really has been one of the larger catalysts for growth in this community. And he was willing to sit down with me for a few minutes and talk about how to approach those conversations. So I'm here with Cainan Townsend, who is the Director of Education and Public Activities.
Actually, the title just changed.
Okay.
Education and Outreach.
Education and Outreach. So the Director of Education and Outreach here at the Moton Museum in Farmville. And so first of all, thank you so much for sitting down with me, Cainan.
Absolutely.
You are a lifelong resident of Farmville, right? You were sort of born and raised here.
Yep. Third, fourth generation Prince Edward County native.
All right. And you went to college at Longwood, whole deal.
Have not been able to get rid of me just yet.
Well, in that case, let's go ahead and just jump on in, yeah?
Sure.
After living here for your whole life, I mean, really, you take a job at the Moton Museum, which really sort of like ingrains you in the cultural history of the town in a very real way, right?
Absolutely.
For anyone who doesn't know, can you sort of briefly explain what the Moton Museum is, and then use that sort of as a jumping off point to discuss how it has helped shape the communal culture and growth of Farmville?
Sure. So Farmville, yeah, very interesting place. And like you said, I have lived here my entire life. I accepted this job at Moton 4 years ago in August, this upcoming August. So Moton, rewinding back into the late 1930s, was the first African-American high school built in Prince Edward County. Prior to then, African-Americans could only go up through 6th grade or drop out before then, just kind of depending on their individual situations and such. But this building was built in 1939 as the first black high school. It served as a school building from 1939 until about 1993, give or take. So during that time, there was a new high school that was built, so this building would become just kind of an extra middle school wing, just depending on the year, sometimes with 5th grade, sometimes with 8th grade building. It becomes famous of sorts because of a strike that took place here on April 23rd, 1951, where students were fed up with the conditions at Roberts and Moton High School, the African-American students, and so they decided to lead a protest because white students had better buses, better materials, better facilities, better everything. And there were 2 white high schools as opposed to 1 black high school. The population here was more than double what the building was built for. It was built for about 180 students, and they had about 450 students here in this very building. And they didn't think it was fair, so they sued. In that case, Davis versus the County School Board of Prince Edward County would eventually lead into being a part of Brown versus Board of Education. Davis, which is a case that not a lot of people know about. Brown v. Board is a case that everybody learns about in their U.S. history classes. So it combines with other 4 court cases, becomes Brown v. Board. Luckily, they win, forcing schools throughout the nation to desegregate. That was kind of the first part of that. The latter part is in reaction to the Brown decision, essentially. Prince Edward decides that, well, you can't force us to desegregate schools if we don't have schools to desegregate. So in response, they closed down 18 schools at the time, black and white, and they would remain closed from September of 1959 to September of 1964. So for 5 years, there was no public schools here in Prince Edward County, which was unprecedented then, still to this day. Other schools had closed, but the next closest was probably about a year. But for 5 years, I mean, that just was something that was unprecedented. So then you have a mass exodus out of the county, black and white citizens. You have a private school open up exclusively for white students to attend. But if you were poor and white, or if you were black, you basically just had to figure it out. You're out of luck. So many folks left, many folks sent their kids away to live with relatives if they had them. And then many, a large contingent of folks just went without an education. A large coalition of black citizens, and then a, small contingent of white citizens who couldn't afford to go to the private school. My dad was one of those people, and his siblings. He's 3 of 9, and the first 5 of his siblings, including him, were impacted by this. My dad was going to start first grade in September of 1959. So this is before kindergarten, so we were going to school for the first time. He was going to start then. Schools don't open. He sits on a farm in Maharan, Virginia, and works until he goes back when schools reopen, 11 years old in the first grade. So I do strongly consider him to be one of the lucky ones, and because he at least got to go and start. He didn't have his education interrupted per se. So like if you were in 6th or 7th grade, when schools let out, you wait around for 4 or 5 years, be 17, 18, and then want you to go back into 6th grade. Which didn't sit well with a lot of people who had been working full time. So a lot of people never returned. So we become famous for the strike, this community, right? It's a big deal. This is before Rosa Parks, it's before Martin Luther King Jr., it's before Malcolm X, it's before the Civil Rights Movement, right? 1951. But we become infamous for these school closings, something that no other county did, something that was so awful and impacted so many people in this community in a negative way. Back then, Farmville was the spot, as I like to say. This is before the major highways were, I-95, 64 were completed construction. So that means people had to travel Route 15 a lot more. Route 15, you had to go straight through Farmville. So anybody going farther south, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, had to come down 15 and come through Farmville. So that's why Main Street looked a lot different back then. It was bright, it was vibrant. There was a lot of hotels, a lot of restaurants, a lot of places to shop, a lot of things to do, because it was a spot, it was a hub. But I can't give you a direct correlation, but I can say that the schools were closed and then highways got built around us, right? Still something we're researching to this day, but thinking of how that changed the trajectory of this community, it just is mind-boggling. So that's a brief kind of 1939 to present kind of summary of what the history is, what this building is. We're a museum. We've been open as a museum since 2001, and we preserve that history. We continue to talk about history in the hopes to not only educate, but make sure this really awful stuff doesn't happen again. So hopefully that answers the questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So I've lived here for like 10 years now in Farmville. And Farmville has always been a very welcoming place for me and my family. Sure. And it does, while it's not, as you say, like the spot anymore necessarily, because of the way the highway structure is, it does have a very strong sort of that, if you think about the idyllic small town, feel, it has a lot of that. And it's never been a struggle for us to sort of meet people and be a part of groups here.
Sure.
But, as somebody who is a transplant in this community, how close to the surface are the scars of the late 50s, early 60s, sort of during the school closing, that lockout generation? How close are those things really to the surface that may not be readily apparent to somebody like me who isn't really from here?
Sure. I think everything that is the county, right? I think our literacy rate here in Prince Edward County, which is far lower than what an area like this should look like. I don't want to give you an exact number because I don't want to be incorrect, but this is a large contingent of folks who are either illiterate or partially literate, and that kind of stuff gets passed down, right? So, Dad never learned how to read because he dropped out, right? And so that means that he's not going to be able to help his son, Junior, with homework, and so on and so on, right? Or the idea of being disenfranchised in general to the idea of education, right? That's something that gets passed down. In 64, when schools reopened, it will take 12 years at minimum for the schools to return to normal. And by normal, I mean not having 22-year-olds with 17-year-olds, right? And that's a senior, or 11-year-olds with 6-year-olds as a first grader. It would take that much time to not have Johnny Sr. riding the same bus with Johnny Jr. because he had a kid when the schools were closed or right before. So in 1976, 1977, give or take, we are normal. But then when the kids of the people who are locked out of schools are going back to school, the parents are sending notes home the parents are sending notes to the teachers saying, I didn't go to school, I turned out fine. Don't send these textbooks home anymore, they're gonna be firewood, right? So, and that's not that long ago. The 70s, it's really not that, 40 years, right? That's not a significant chunk of time in the grand scheme of things. So, fast forward, that gets passed down. And the other part is that the people who left when the schools were closed, it wasn't our poor, it wasn't our uneducated, it was our doctors, it was our nurses, it was our credentialed, it was our teachers, right? It was our people who could afford to move. The people who stayed, for the most part, were the folks who had to stay. And so thinking about that and the culture of being disenfranchised and what that meant and that resentment that you hold. There's stories of, working at Longwood. There was a lady whose name I won't put her out, but she worked for the dining hall 40 years. She was a product of the schools being closed. She retired, no pension, no benefits, no retirement. She had nothing to show for 4 decades of her life that she committed to doing this work and serving these students. So when you ask how close is it to the surface, I think it is the surface. I think the problems may masquerade as something else, so poverty here in Prince Edward County, about 19%, give or take, which is not great in and of itself. But then when you take a step further and you look at what's called an ALICE condition, so asset limited, income constrained, but employed. So if the poverty level is $15,000, $16,000 or something per one individual, they're right above that, right? Which means you're not doing well, you're not technically in poverty, but you're living paycheck to paycheck at best. So poverty rates about 19%. ALICE conditions are about 30%. So about half the county, 49%, is either below the poverty level or treading water so much that they're basically drowning. So I think that's a direct cause of these school closings. So I think in terms of how close it is to the surface, again, I think it is the surface. I just think some of these issues may present themselves as other things.
With that in mind, I expect that as I start going across the country and actually visiting some of these small towns, and the reason I want to visit small towns is I believe that I'm going to find that small towns do have very strong senses of community and identity, which will make it easy to sort of find commonalities and differences as they exist.
Right.
But I think one of the things that I'm going to find, or that I expect to find, is that a lot of the places I'm going are going to have very similar histories and issues. And I think that it's going to be very similar to what you just described, where it really is the surface, we just don't recognize it as the surface.
Right.
Since my goal is to sort of try and put things out there in as a positive light as possible, the easiest way to do that would be to just talk to people who had not been marginalized.
Sure.
But I don't really want to do that.
Right.
And so how, as someone who, as the director of education for an institution like Moton Museum, who has been in a town like Farmville that has directly affected your understanding of the world,
right.
How do I approach telling these stories, asking these questions as sort of a, I want to be honest, but I do definitely want to be, I do want to be positive as well. How do I approach that?
I think it depends on what you mean by positive.
Okay.
I think, in my definition of positivity is being honest and being authentic. It's recognizing the good with the bad, right? To me, being positive is just being transparent and being authentic. If there's an issue, if you go to a town that used to have a prominent coal mine that's not there anymore, point that out, but also point out how people have adapted, right? What have people done to overcome that type of thing? I think the thing about small towns, and not all, but certainly a lot of them, I think a trend that you'll find is that they can smell an outsider from a mile away. I think what's interesting about here in particular is that you could live here for 50 years. If you weren't born here, you ain't from here, which is to me very odd. But and then you could break that down even more. depending on what part of the county you're from, if you're not from this part of the county, you're not, actually up in the in crowd. And it's just like, I've lived here my entire life, but I'm not in because I was born in Farmville instead of Darlington Heights or Meharron or Rice. And it's just interesting. And I think people from small towns just have the ability to perceive when somebody's trying to take advantage of them, I guess. And that's happened here quite a bit. People trying to come in and, make their careers off the back of these people's history. So I think for you, the big thing, especially here and I'm sure other places, is just authenticity. Go in, be your honest self, be authentic, be transparent. And I think the positivity comes from giving a very authentic, transparent view of what's happening. I think it's disingenuous to go and just, oh, well, these, there's been 15 businesses that have closed down here and just not mention that, right? Because if that's important to them, that, everything needs the context, right? So why have if you're talking about like a new club or something that started up in this small town, why has it started up? Oh, because it needed to fill the void of these 15 businesses being closed. Like, I think context is key. But I think as long as you're being, again, transparent and authentic, I think it comes through as positive and productive and good, and that the people will appreciate that as opposed to spinning it one orientation or the other, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you very much for sitting down with me, Cainan. I really appreciate your thoughts. I know my questions were kind of open-ended, and that makes them kind of funky to answer.
Sure.
But I'm looking for sort of broad picture ideas right now to sort of think about as I'm moving forward.
Sure.
Is there anything that you think that I should be sort of keeping in mind as I move forward over the course of the next year, getting ready to go out on this trail of this project that maybe I didn't ask about, or just general advice that you think I should keep in mind beyond just be authentic?
Yeah, I think I just double down on that one. I think just people will smell you if you have the worst, any kind of bad intentions from a mile away. I think the authenticity just kind of shows like, hey, I'm here. This is the point of what I'm doing this for. And, it's a showcase of you all, right, in your town and how great it is and how great community is. I think that's the authenticity piece. I don't think I can nail enough because that's something that's really hard to teach. Mm-hmm. It's kind of an intangible in that sense because, like I said, a lot of people have come through here, oh, I'm writing a paper on this, oh, I'm creating this film, oh, I'm doing this. I'm like, all right, well, come just take our stories and leave, right? Like, but I think what you're trying to do is a little bit different. And I think just telling them that, like, look, this isn't this, I'm not just coming in to try to make $1 million. Like, I'm here to tell a story, right? And I think that's really, really important. And I think you're doing that. So thank you for doing this. It's really neat.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So I think I may actually have more questions for Cainan now than I did before we sat down. But the idea of be authentic, be upfront, be on the level, ask the hard questions, but tell them why. That I can do. I can do that. Okay. Time to get to work.